Newly elected Congressman Pete Sessions of Texas, Ann Northup of Kentucky, and Mike Pappas of New Jersey will discuss the 105th Congress. And then at 8:45 p.m. Eastern, we'll return to the GOPAC conference for live coverage of a speech by House Speaker Newt Gingrich. That's here on C-SPAN. And now NASDAQ stock market president Alfred Berkeley. Tuesday, he discussed the election and its effect on the economy. His comments last 20 minutes. But first, we'll hear from Concord Coalition co-founder Warren Rudman.
Well, our next speaker, Alfred Berkeley, who is president of NASDAQ, I'm particularly delighted to have him here. For those of you that read the Wall Street Journal, both here and abroad, about a year and a half ago, the chairman of the SEC, Arthur Levitt, and the head of the National Association of Security Dealers asked me to head up a commission to address some of the problems that were quite prevalent at the time in NASD. As a result of that, our commission, which worked for a year, recommended sweeping changes in which we essentially separated the various arms of the National Association of Securities Dealers in this country and set up NASDAQ as essentially a separate and relatively autonomous corporation with its own board, took the entire regulatory and discipline aspects out of the corporation and set up NASDR for regulation, now headed by Mary Shapiro, very well known for her enforcement activities, and the holding company, NASD itself. So in a small way, Mr. Berkeley, I'm responsible for you getting your new job, and I hope you're enjoying it. Al Berkeley was appointed president of the NASDAQ stock market on the 9th of May of this year. Before that, he was managing director and a senior banker in the corporate finance department of Alex Brown and Company. He joined Brown in '72 and became a general partner in '83. I think the most unique part of his background, however, is that he obviously, from his resume, which you have, has a very, very thorough working knowledge and a practical working knowledge of the technology of information management, which is becoming so central to markets in general, and I think to NASDAQ in particular. We're delighted to have Al Berkeley join us this morning.
Thank you, sir. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I think the right approach is for me to tell you a little bit about some of the changes that the NASDAQ stock market is undergoing and to make myself available for your questions. I would like to pick up a little bit on Mr. Eisenstadt's comments about the European venture capital community and talk briefly about the role of NASDAQ in the formation of ESDAQ, and then a little bit about what we're seeing in the relationship between venture activity and economic activity in some other parts of the world. As many of you know, we played a very small financial role, about $60,000 worth in founding ESDAQ, but we are quite proud of our contribution in terms of some of the approaches, not only to systems but also to market structure and to regulation. And I think ESDAQ has the potential of being a very important link in the economic development chain. If I take you back to 1971, when the NASDAQ was established as a way of pulling together quotations on relatively hard-to-trade securities, and if I take you to 1975, when the ERISA Act was passed and permitted corporate investors and professional money managers to allocate legally a portion of their business, of their funds, to what had traditionally been perceived as much more speculative venture activities. And if I take you to the capital gains cut of the Tax Reform Act of 1978, you have the three pieces that came together to create the financial side of the rather vibrant economic development that we've had through our venture capital industry. It took, in addition to those legal, technical, and financial components, it also took a country with an emphasis on technology and a spirit of entrepreneurialism and growth. But I have been struck in the 4 or 5 months I've been in this job with the number of countries who have come to talk to us about how they can create an entrepreneurial economy. I've had members of the Japanese Diet, I've had representatives from Scotland, I've had representatives from Australia, and several other countries come and talk about what is it about NASDAQ and how does it contribute to the entrepreneurial spirit of this country, and how does all that work? These issues become very poignant when you realize that we have taken over 3,300 companies into the NASDAQ since 1990. And we've taken over 460 new companies in since the beginning of this year. Some of those have grown to be quite large and are quite prosperous and are highly visible. But our national policy function is to provide capital to companies in the primary market. The secondary market trading that we do, where you and I spend most of our time, is a necessary prerequisite to having a strong principal capital market where companies are available, where capital is available to companies for factories, for computers, for jobs, etc. I would suggest to you that until the NASDAQ became an effective outlet for venture capital investments, the time horizon for putting money at risk in private companies and getting it up to where it could be a listed company under our normal standards on the American Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange was just too long to make that venture capital worth the risk. And that by coming in and joining an efficient market into the 5, 6, 7 year time horizon of corporate growth, you got away from having to have money involved for 8 to 15 years till the company got much larger. And that allowed that money to be recycled again and again and again, and became a very important factor in our economic growth in this country and the growth of the technology industries. I joined Alex. Brown & Sons in 1972 and was lucky enough in 1975 to co-found its technology practice and to get focused on the software industry. I wish I could tell you that I was far-sighted and wise. It just was a lucky choice, and my whole team had no idea of what we were kind of hooking onto at the time. But we did have the privilege of working on 300 or 400. I have had the privilege of working, or my team has had the privilege of working on 400 or 500 technology company financing since 1975, including Microsoft and Oracle and Sun and Novell and lots of other companies that are quite large now. This gives me an unusual perspective. I started as a research analyst, and I think about things from the point of view of the investor. And I think it may be one of the reasons that I was selected for this job, because I've been in every part of the investment business except trading. And I find myself having to learn the vocabulary of trading, running the most sophisticated trading system in the world. We think that there are some things that are going on in our market now that it's important for you to know. The first of these, and looking at this from another country's perspective, I would point out to you that we're trying to make this market more fair. We had a situation that had grown up because of the growth of this market and because of the specialization that you find in entrepreneurial open market formats. Remember, you don't have to do anything more than take a test of knowledge and ethics and have a little bit of capital to become a member of our market. And we like that open model. We think it's the right model. We invite all participants who want to become part of our market to do so. In many ways, we sort of consider ourselves both on the market maker side and on the company side, sort of the Ellis Island of capitalism. And we welcome all comers, and we think that's the right model, and we have a way of sorting out the good from the bad, and it works pretty well. That being said, we had a situation in which, primarily because of the growth of specialized communications networks and just the growth of our market, that we had institutions trading together at very narrow spreads, and we had individuals trading at a more expensive, more widely quoted price. And while I can defend this on economic terms and with explanations of relative buying power, the cost of service, wholesale transactions, etc., it became fundamentally untenable politically for us and for the country, because unlike other markets where wholesale transactions are typically separated from retail transactions, in our market we have just enough transparency so that, thank you, so that the retail customer, I like to use my mother as the example, who buys her stock at $10 a share, sees the large institutional trade, one trade ahead of hers at $9.50 and the next one after her at $9.50, and she believes that she's not been treated fairly. Again, this is not economics, this is politics, and we have undertaken with the SEC to try to fix that. The specific mechanism will be to enable individual investors to place their limit orders in to their broker-dealer and have those limit orders expressed in the market maker's quote if that price is better than the market maker's price would have been without that order. It's a pretty fundamental change. Excuse me. Pretty fundamental change. We would like to add another change on top of that with an electronic limit order book wherein individual investors could meet in the market without the intervention of a market maker. We're debating the pros and cons of that with the investment community in America and with the SEC as we speak. We think that's an important next step, but we think that the SEC order handling rules that we're struggling to get in place by January 10th will in fact give a quantitative improvement to our market, and it will be a better, fairer market for individual investors and indeed for everybody. Now, the implications of this are important, but we also have another initiative that we think is also important, and that is we are dramatically expanding our use of the World Wide Web. We're going to put a tremendous amount of information on our companies that are listed on our market for investors all over the world on the World Wide Web. It's www.nasdaq.com if you're a web surfer. We had 2,200,000 hits each day last week. This is a very large and very powerful website that's being used by people from around the world. And we have great promise, great hopes that it will bring a tremendous transparency to our market, tremendous understanding of the investing process, and really global access to the information that we're making available. It's all in English as we speak, but we do have plans to make it available in additional languages. And we think this is, we think the web is a important punctuation point in technological history, that it is a better, different way to present information to people because that information is available from anywhere in the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, another thing that we've done that you may notice while you're here is that we have begun to tell the American investor, and there are roughly 60 million American investors who trade at least once a year. We have tighter and tighter groups of people who trade once a month, trade once a week, trade once a day and more than once a day in the way we segment our market. But we're using national advertising to draw our American investors' attention to the World Wide Web. I've gotten calls from people on Madison Avenue who said, "Are you crazy? This is stupid. You're using national advertising to talk to an audience of maybe 500,000 or 1 million or maybe 2 million web users if you're lucky, and you're talking to 60 million people about it." Well, we happen to think that web availability is going to be tremendous and ubiquitous very shortly, and you may have noticed that both Thomson and Phillips have produced and are selling in the United States small boxes that are attached to your television to bring the World Wide Web to the television sets in this country. And we think that's going to be an important technological avenue for us to talk to people about investing. We happen to know through a lot of our focus groups that people are very interested in investing. For the first time last year in the United States, there were more assets in mutual funds than there were in commercial banks. What you're seeing is I'm not sure the word panic is too strong. I don't want to overstate it, but you're seeing a lot of people my age, I'm a 1944 baby, who are suddenly very concerned about their ability to retire in another 10 or 15 years and really wondering how they're going to have a standard of living that makes sense to them. We, like every other nation in the world, are facing the issue of whether or not our retirement plans are sufficient. Clearly, the government is not going to be able to provide for people in the way that some people had expected. Whether you believe it should or not is a different issue. We think people realize in this country that they're going to have to be self-sufficient, and the returns that are available to them in more traditional financial products are simply not high enough to get them where they need to be. So they're turning to the equity markets in greater and greater numbers. And we think it's important that these equity markets be fair, that they be easily accessible, that there be a lot of information about them for people who are beginners all the way through people who are very, very experienced. Those are the main points that I wanted to make to you. I would be delighted to take questions. Put you to sleep? Yeah.
Right back here, if you could bring a microphone over there. It's amazing the number of hits.
Just a quick.
Oh, it's awesome. Yeah, there's a real demand out
Quick question on your website. What type of information are you going to have available? Is it sort of company homepages, any sort of other type of information there, news reports?
Yeah, the question is what sort of information is available on www.nasdaq.com. The first and foremost thing that people are coming for are prices of securities. We have pricing available on all 5,400 NASDAQ securities. We're going to have all American traded securities. In about a week, we're going to have all the mutual funds available. We basically have about an 18-month program of adding things as our technical staff is able to do it. The most recent addition was a 5-year price history and a charting capability for price and volume. We're in the process of negotiating with one of the major news vendors right now to provide news on the stock that you're looking at on the quote page. There will be a little button for news. We've linked to approximately 2,000 of our company's own corporate homepages, and we're asking them, and we think that they're the proper location for this and the proper source of this, to provide what we're calling institutional quality fundamental information about their company. As you know, disclosure is a big issue in this country. The idea that we operate under in our law is that all investors should receive the same information at the same time. We think the World Wide Web is an ideal way to do that. We're adding a couple of hundred companies a month to this linkage. Most of them are two-way, where they will link back to the NASDAQ. We also go over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, where we tap into the Edgar files, which are the legally required filings by companies. Those pages at the SEC are quite slow, partially because they've got a lot of demand and partially because they need a little more horsepower in their communications network. I've been beating on a couple of the commissioners at the SEC to make that investment, and they're clearly aware of the issue, and I think they're working on it. Over time, we will add a whole series of additional information services. We're not trying to compete with the real-time quote vendors. These are 15-minute delay quotes that we're providing, and we're not trying to deal with the professional investor per se. We're trying to close the gap between the extremely convenient information that the institutional investor has and the extremely inconvenient path that the retail investor has to take to get information. But we think that there's a distinctly different market there. That was a long answer to a short question.
Is there anyone else here? All right, right here.
If Proposition 211 gets passed, what impact is that going to have on companies coming to the market, particularly in California?
Okay, the question is related to a proposition that's on the California ballot that happens to have national significance. And the question is, what happens in our market if Proposition 211 passes? There are many, many features to Proposition 211, and the methodology that's used in a number of our western states to modify their constitutions, their state constitutions. In California, it happens to be a popular vote, and therefore is subject to a lot of emotionalism, probably advertising sensitive, etc. This particular proposition has a lot of features to it that are damaging to corporations, but the NASDAQ has gotten involved in this fight for two very specific reasons. One of the effects, we believe, of Proposition 211 would be to substantially reduce the amount of information that companies would be willing to give investors in terms of projections or prospective forward-looking statements about their business. And we think that the nation needs to go exactly the opposite way. It needs to protect companies from our legal system is particularly entrepreneurial, and We think that we need to provide safe harbors for companies that encourage them, and I would go as far as to indeed require them to talk about their future, because that's what investment's all about, is betting on the future with an informed view. The second dimension that we think is unfortunate about this particular proposition is that it pits the legitimate interests of long-term investors, which is what we believe these markets really ought to be about, in spite of the fact that you see all this day trading in our markets. We think this pits long-term investors against short-term investors, and that in the long term, some of the price aberrations that come about in the normal business cycle and the normal release of information about corporate results are not the great tragedies that the plaintiffs' bar would have you believe, that they are in fact exactly what ought to happen in a free market, that prices ought to adjust, and that when substantial portions of a company's equity can be removed from its accounts because of these intermediate and short-term fluctuations, when the company perhaps is quite healthy on the long term, that this is a balancing of short-term versus long-term interest that's not appropriate for a long-term economic growth. So I have not sought to address the issues of directors' liability and